She would sneakily throw away the food his mother had prepared, but never said why. When her husband set up the camera to find out the truth, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. Subscribe and write in the comments from where you're watching this video. Matthew adjusted the cuffs of his shirt as he glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound filling the apartment. From the living room, he could hear the faint murmur of the evening news playing on the television where Nia was curled up on the couch, a book resting on her lap. It was a familiar scene, one he had grown to cherish, these quiet moments before dinner when the world outside seemed to slow down, but tonight something felt different. A tension, almost imperceptible yet present, lingered in the air. He had noticed it over the past few months, creeping into their home like an uninvited guest. Nia had become more reserved, her laughter less frequent, her smiles often forced. At first, he chalked it up to stress from work. Her promotion at the gallery had increased her responsibilities, and he knew how dedicated she was to curating the perfect exhibitions. But deep down, he suspected there was more to it. His mother's name sat heavy on his tongue, but he hesitated before speaking it aloud. Helen had always been a strong presence in his life, the kind of woman who commanded respect through sheer will and an unshakable sense of tradition. When his father passed away, she had poured all her energy into raising him, ensuring that he followed in the footsteps of his family's heritage. He had grown up in the warmth of her Italian cooking, the scent of fresh basil and garlic a constant in their home, and yet that warmth had never extended to Nia. From the moment he introduced them, he had sensed his mother's discomfort. It wasn't overt, not at first. She had been polite, offering a measured smile and a carefully neutral tone, but it was the small things, the way she never addressed Nia by name unless absolutely necessary, the subtle way she excluded her from family conversations, the lingering glances filled with something he couldn't quite place. At their engagement party, Helen had spent the evening glued to the side of an old family friend, whispering about how surprised she was that Matthew had chosen someone so different. When confronted, she had dismissed it as a misunderstanding. "You're imagining things," she had said, brushing off his concerns with a wave of her hand. But it hadn't stopped there. The wedding had been a carefully balanced act, an unspoken battle of wills between his mother and his wife. Helen had made it clear, in ways both subtle and not, that she disapproved. She never said it outright, never voiced her discontent directly, but it was in the way she held herself, in the carefully chosen words that skirted around the truth. As the months passed, Matthew had clung to the hope that things would change. He had imagined his mother growing fond of Nia, coming to see the woman he had fallen in love with. But that day had never come. Instead, Helen's presence in their lives had become a source of quiet strain, an undercurrent of tension that neither he nor Nia spoke about aloud. Tonight, they were expected at Helen's house for dinner. Another attempt at reconciliation, another evening of forced politeness and veiled barbs. Matthew had tried to convince himself that this time would be different, that maybe his mother had finally decided to accept Nia as a part of the family. He wasn't sure if he believed it. Nia closed her book as he stepped into the living room, setting it aside on the coffee table. She looked up at him with a soft, tired smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. He hesitated before speaking, knowing that the words would only add to the weight already pressing on her shoulders. "We should probably get going," he said. Nia nodded, but she didn't move right away. Instead, she exhaled slowly, as if gathering the strength to face whatever awaited them at Helen's house. As they stepped out into the night, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement, Matthew reached for her hand. She squeezed his fingers lightly, a silent reassurance, but he could feel the tension in her grip. By the time they arrived, Helen was already waiting at the door, her expression unreadable. The house smelled of roasted tomatoes and fresh herbs, a scent that should have been comforting but instead felt suffocating. Dinner was a carefully choreographed dance of civility. Helen asked about Matthew's work, about the latest projects at his firm. She never once asked Nia about hers. The conversation moved in circles, skimming over the surface of deeper tensions, avoiding the unspoken truth that lay just beneath. The food was rich and heavy, the kind of meal meant to impress, but Nia ate little. She picked at her plate, her expression carefully neutral. Helen noticed. She always noticed. "You're not eatin' much," she remarked, her tone light but pointed. Nia offered a small smile. "I'm just not very hungry." Helen's lips pressed together in a way that almost looked like satisfaction. By the time they left, Matthew's head was pounding. Nia was silent beside him in the car, staring out the window. Something had shifted tonight. He didn't know what, but he could feel it. The space between them felt heavier, filled with words neither of them had spoken. As they pulled into their driveway, he reached for her hand again. This time, she didn't squeeze back. Matthew lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of Nia's breathing beside him. The house was silent except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren somewhere in the city. Sleep refused to come, his mind tangled with thoughts of the evening at his mother's house. The tension in the air had been thick, palpable, yet nothing had been said outright. That was Helen's way. Her disapproval was never direct, never spoken in blunt words, but it was always there, lingering in the space between glances, in the slight pauses before she spoke to Nia, in the way she never quite addressed her directly. He turned his head slightly, watching as Nia shifted in her sleep, her brows furrowing even in rest. She hadn't eaten much at dinner, had barely touched her plate, and though she had offered a small smile when Helen had commented on it, Matthew had seen the look in her eyes. He had felt her hesitation, her unease, the weight of something unspoken pressing down on her. The next morning, the discomfort hadn't faded. Over breakfast, Nia moved sluggishly around the kitchen, her usual energy dampened. She set a cup of coffee in front of him and leaned against the counter, rubbing her temple with one hand. "You okay?" he asked, watching her carefully. She nodded but didn't meet his gaze. "Just tired." He hesitated. "You didn't eat much last night. Are you sure you're feeling all right?" Nia exhaled softly, as if weighing her words before she spoke. "I just didn't feel like eating." Matthew frowned. Was it the food? Did it taste off? She hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. Then she shook her head. No, it was fine. It wasn't an outright lie, but it wasn't the truth either. He could tell. Something was bothering her, something about last night, and she wasn't telling him what it was. He didn't press further, but as he left for work that morning, the thought stayed with him. A few days later, his phone buzzed with an unexpected message from his mother. It was an invitation to dinner at her house again, only this time she framed it differently. She wrote about wanting to mend fences, about making an effort to do things right. There was a warmth in her words that hadn't been there before, an unusual softness that felt almost unnatural coming from her. Matthew hesitated before bringing it up to Nia. He knew she wouldn't want to go. He could already see the tired expression she would give him, the forced neutrality in her voice as she said, "If you want to, we can." And then she would sit through another evening of barely veiled condescension, another dinner where she was made to feel like an outsider in his family's home. Still, he brought it up over dinner, carefully gauging her reaction. "She wants us over again?" Nia said, stirring her fork through the pasta on her plate without taking a bite. "She says she wants to make things right." Nia let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "That's new?" Matthew sighed. "Look, I know it hasn't been easy, but maybe this time it'll be different." She looked at him then, really looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face for something. He didn't know what she was looking for, but whatever it was, she didn't seem to find it. "If you think it's worth trying, then fine," she said eventually, but there was no conviction in her voice. Matthew knew this wasn't just about a dinner invitation. It was about trust, about whether he truly saw what was happening, whether he understood the weight of what his mother's disapproval meant. And the truth was, he wasn't sure he did. Not fully. The evening of the dinner, the tension started before they even left the house. Nia was quiet as she got ready, her movements slower than usual. Matthew caught her glancing at her reflection in the mirror with something almost like hesitation, as if she were bracing herself for what was to come. Helen greeted them with an uncharacteristic warmth, a smile that felt just a little too polished. The table was set beautifully, a spread of dishes that looked carefully curated, as though she had gone out of her way to create the perfect meal. "I wanted to make something special," she said as she gestured for them to sit. "I know things haven't been easy between us, but I want to fix that." Matthew wanted to believe her. He really did. Dinner started out pleasantly enough. Helen asked Matthew about his work, nodded approvingly at his responses. She even made a few light comments about the architecture firm he worked at, pretending an interest she had never shown before. But as the meal went on, her attention barely strayed to Nia. She never asked about the gallery, never inquired about her projects, never even made the effort to include her in the conversation. It was as if she was tolerating her presence rather than accepting it. The food was rich, full of the familiar flavors of Matthew's childhood: roasted tomatoes, fresh basil, slow-cooked sauces. It should have been comforting, a reminder of home. But as he ate, he noticed that Nia was barely touching her plate again. She moved her food around, took small, careful bites, but she wasn't really eating. Helen noticed too. "You're not eating much again," she said, her voice light, almost casual. Nia gave her a small, polite smile. "I guess I'm just not that hungry." Helen's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's a shame. I put so much effort into making everything just right." Matthew shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the tension building between them. "I appreciate it," Nia said, her voice even. "Really." But Helen didn't let it go. "Are you sure it's not just that you're not used to our kind of food? I know different cultures have different tastes after all." The words were spoken so smoothly, so effortlessly, that at first Matthew almost didn't register them. But the second he saw the way Nia's posture stiffened, the way her grip tightened around her fork, he knew she had. She forced another small smile, but there was no warmth in it. "No, that's not it," Helen hummed, as if considering. "Well, I hope you're not feeling unwell. That would be unfortunate." Nia didn't respond. Matthew wanted to say something, to cut through the growing tension, but the moment passed before he could find the words. The rest of the dinner was stilted, the conversation fragmented. By the time they left, the silence between him and Nia was almost deafening. In the car, she didn't speak. She stared out the window, her expression unreadable. Matthew gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. He wanted to ask if she was okay, but he already knew the answer. He just didn't know what to do about it. The drive home from Helen's house was cloaked in silence. The streetlights flashed through the windows in rhythmic intervals, casting brief glows across Nia's face before vanishing into the darkness again. She didn't speak, didn't turn to look at him. Her fingers were laced together in her lap, knuckles slightly taut, as though she were holding on to something invisible, something she didn't want to let slip. Matthew's grip on the steering wheel was firm, his mind looping back to the dinner, replaying every moment in search of an explanation, a way to make sense of what had happened. He wanted to believe that his mother's comment had been nothing more than an offhand remark, an unfortunate slip of the tongue rather than something deliberate, but deep down, he knew better. Helen was always calculated in her words, in the way she phrased things just carefully enough to sound innocent while carrying something heavier underneath. It was her way. Never openly hostile, never direct. Just enough to be felt, but not enough to be proven. Nia's silence stretched between them like a widening fault line, and by the time they pulled into their driveway, Matthew felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. He turned off the engine, but neither of them moved to get out. The sound of the cooling car ticked softly in the quiet night. "Are you okay?" he asked finally, breaking the stillness. She let out a breath through her nose, slow and measured. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. He could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, the way she avoided his gaze. He wanted to push, to ask her to talk to him, but he knew that if he did, she would only retreat further. Inside, the apartment felt cold despite the usual warmth of their home. Nia went straight to the bedroom without another word, leaving Matthew standing in the dim light of the living room, staring at nothing. He exhaled heavily, running a hand over his face before finally following her. By the time he reached the bedroom, she was already in bed, facing away from him. The next morning, Nia moved through the kitchen with an efficiency that felt almost rehearsed, as if she were forcing herself through the motions of normalcy. Matthew watched her as she prepared her tea, stirring absent-mindedly even after the honey had long since dissolved. "You barely ate anything last night," he said after a moment. She paused but didn't look up. "I wasn't hungry." "You said the same thing last time." She finally lifted her gaze to meet his, and for a second he saw something flicker there. Hesitation, maybe even fear, but just as quickly it was gone. "Matt, please," she said softly, almost pleading. "Can we not do this?" He wanted to press, to ask her outright what was wrong, but something in her tone stopped him. Instead, he nodded, though the unease in his gut didn't fade. That evening, after coming home from work, Matthew was in the kitchen when he noticed something that gave him pause. The trash can, which had been nearly empty in the morning, was now filled with crumpled paper towels. That, in itself, wasn't unusual. But beneath them, partially obscured, was something that made him stop. A takeout container. Not just any container, one from his mother's house. He recognized it immediately, the sturdy white box with the green logo from the Italian deli Helen often used for leftovers. His breath hitched slightly as he reached down and lifted the container. It was still heavy, the contents untouched. A strange, creeping feeling curled in his stomach. He turned toward the fridge, opened it, and scanned the shelves. The other containers from last night's dinner, the ones Helen had insisted they take home, were missing. He stood there for a long moment, his mind turning over what he was seeing, trying to rationalize it. Nia had thrown away the food, not eaten it, not stored it for later. She'd gotten rid of it entirely. Matthew closed the fridge, his pulse a little too loud in his ears. He had no idea what to make of it. That night, after Nia had gone to bed, he checked the trash again. 3 more containers, all buried under layers of paper towels and coffee grounds, all completely full. A strange, unsettling thought settled into the back of his mind. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't a one-time thing, a simple case of not being hungry. This was deliberate. The next morning, he waited until she left for work before checking again. The garbage had been taken out, the evidence gone. Over the next week, he paid closer attention. When Helen sent home leftovers, they always vanished by the next morning. If they were eating at Helen's, Nia barely touched her food. If she was forced to take a bite, she chewed it too slowly, swallowed it with an effort that didn't seem natural. And when she thought he wasn't looking, she would discreetly move her food around her plate rather than eat it. Matthew didn't know what unsettled him more, the fact that she was doing this or the fact that she hadn't said a word about it. One evening, he came home earlier than expected and walked in just in time to see Nia at the trash can, her hand hesitating over a container of pasta before she dumped it and quickly covered it with a napkin. She froze when she saw him. For a long second, neither of them spoke. Then, carefully, she closed the lid of the trash can and turned to face him. Matthew exhaled slowly. "Nia, what's going on?" She pressed her lips together, looking at him with something that almost resembled guilt. But beneath that, there was something else, something deeper. "Nothing," she said finally. "Don't do that. Don't lie to me." She let out a slow breath, then shook her head. "Matt, please, just let it go." But he couldn't. Not anymore. He watched as she brushed past him as she left the kitchen without another word. But long after she was gone, he remained standing there, staring at the closed trash can, a sense of unease settling deep in his bones. Something was wrong, and he was going to find out what. Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The image of Nia throwing away his mother's food haunted him, embedding itself into his thoughts like a splinter he couldn't remove. It wasn't just that she hadn't wanted to eat it, it was that she had made a deliberate effort to hide it from him. The way she carefully buried the containers beneath layers of trash, the way she avoided his gaze when he caught her, it was all too intentional. But why? At first, he tried to rationalize it. Maybe she simply didn't like his mother's cooking, but that didn't make sense. In the beginning, she had enjoyed it. He remembered how she had once asked his mother for a lasagna recipe, how she had complimented the flavors, how she had seemed genuinely interested in learning the traditional methods of Italian cuisine. But now, she acted as if the very thought of eating it repulsed her. Had something changed? The next time they visited Helen's house, Matthew paid closer attention. The evening played out in its usual uncomfortable rhythm. His mother greeted them with her carefully practiced warmth, setting the table with a spread of homemade dishes, each one meticulously prepared. He noted how she served Nia a plate before she could reach for one herself, how her eyes flickered with something unreadable as she set it down in front of her. Nia's posture was tense. She offered a polite smile, thanked Helen, but didn't immediately eat. Instead, she took her time cutting small portions, moving them around with her fork, pretending to be engaged in conversation while barely taking a bite. Matthew waited, watching. It wasn't until halfway through the meal that she finally took a small bite of pasta. She chewed it carefully, too carefully, as if she were hyper-aware of every movement. He saw the slight twitch in her jaw, the way she swallowed a little too hard. Then she reached for her glass of water and took a long sip, her fingers tight around the stem. Something about the moment unsettled him, but he couldn't quite place why. Later that night, after they returned home, he kept his tone casual as he asked, "Did you like dinner?" Nia hesitated before answering. It was fine. Fine. A neutral, empty response. "You barely ate," he said. She gave a small shrug, her expression unreadable. "I wasn't very hungry." The same excuse, again. Matthew studied her face, searching for something, anything, that might tell him what she wasn't saying. But Nia was good at hiding things when she wanted to be. That much he had learned. Still, something gnawed at him, a slow, creeping suspicion that he couldn't ignore. Days passed, and the pattern continued. Every time Helen sent food home with them, it would disappear by morning. Whenever they ate at her house, Nia barely touched her plate. The more he watched, the more certain he became that it wasn't just about preference. This was something deeper, something intentional. Then the symptoms started. It was gradual at first. Nia would wake up feeling fatigued, rubbing at her temples as if fighting off a lingering headache. Then came the stomach pains, the nausea. At first, she dismissed it as stress or indigestion, but it happened too often to be a coincidence. One evening, as they were settling into bed, she pressed a hand to her stomach and winced. Matthew frowned. "Are you okay?" She exhaled slowly. "I don't know. My stomach just feels off." "That's been happening a lot lately." She nodded, her expression distant. "Yeah, I guess it has." "Have you seen a doctor?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "I figured it would pass." But it didn't pass. The next few weeks were a blur of discomfort for her. She had days where she felt fine, but then the pain would return suddenly, sharp and insistent. There were nights where she curled up on the couch instead of going to bed, too nauseous to lie down. Matthew grew more and more concerned. She wasn't the type to complain about minor things, which meant that whatever she was feeling, it had to be serious. "You should get checked out," he told her one morning as she pushed her breakfast around her plate. "I will," she said, but she didn't sound convinced. That evening, Matthew came home earlier than usual. The apartment was quiet, the scent of coffee lingering faintly in the air. As he set down his keys, his gaze flickered toward the kitchen. And then he saw it. The trash can, lid slightly ajar. He wasn't sure why he moved toward it, why he felt the sudden urge to check, but his gut told him to. Slowly, he lifted the lid. Beneath the usual layers of paper towels and wrappers, he saw it. Another untouched container of food. The same kind Helen always sent home with them. Matthew felt something cold coil in his stomach. It wasn't just a one-time thing. She wasn't just avoiding the food. She was actively getting rid of it. A dozen thoughts raced through his mind. Why wouldn't she just tell him? Was she afraid of hurting his feelings? Or was there another reason? A darker thought crept in, one he didn't want to acknowledge. Was she afraid of the food itself? He didn't confront her right away. Instead, he decided to wait, to watch a little longer, to gather proof of what he was beginning to suspect. That night, as Nia slept beside him, Matthew lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning with possibilities. He needed answers, and he was going to find them. Matthew couldn't let it go. The image of the untouched food buried in the trash gnawed at him, a persistent whisper at the back of his mind that refused to quiet. Every logical explanation he came up with unraveled as quickly as he spun it. If Nia didn't like his mother's food, why not just say so? Why go through the effort of hiding it, disposing of it so meticulously? If she wasn't hungry, Why was it always his mother's food that ended up in the garbage, untouched and uneaten? And if she had no reason to be afraid, why did she hesitate every time she sat at Helen's table? He wanted to believe that there was an innocent explanation, but deep down he knew there wasn't. For days he tried to bring it up again, to create an opening for her to tell him the truth, but every time he broached the subject she withdrew. She was always tired, always distracted, always ready to change the subject. It wasn't just avoidance anymore, it was self-protection. And then there were the symptoms. They had become more frequent. Nia would wake in the morning, looking pale, dark circles forming under her eyes. She started calling in sick to work, something she had never done before, and spent long afternoons curled up on the couch, her hand pressed to her stomach. When Matthew insisted she see a doctor, she only offered weak reassurances, claiming it would pass, that it was just stress or bad digestion. But he didn't believe her anymore. Not after what he had seen. Not after the way her hands trembled when she lifted a fork at his mother's house, the way her lips pressed together after each bite as if she were forcing herself through something unbearable. Not after the food kept vanishing. He needed answers, and if Nia wouldn't give them to him, he had no choice but to find them himself. The idea of setting up a camera unsettled him. It felt like a violation of trust, like stepping over a line he wasn't sure he could come back from. But the alternative, continuing to live in the dark, pretending not to see what was right in front of him, was worse. So, one afternoon while Nia was resting in the bedroom, Matthew set up a small, discreet camera in the kitchen. He placed it in a spot where it had a clear view of the countertops, the fridge, and, most importantly, the trash can. He hated the way it made him feel, as if he were betraying the very foundation of their relationship. But he told himself it was necessary, because something was wrong. And he was running out of time to figure out what. The next evening, Helen invited them over for dinner again. Matthew felt his stomach tighten at the thought, his nerves on edge in a way they had never been before. He watched Nia closely as she got ready, noting the way she moved slower than usual, as if the very act of preparing for another night at Helen's house drained her. In the car, she was quiet. She kept her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window, and Matthew could feel the distance between them growing, stretching wider with every mile. At Helen's house, everything was the same. The same polite smiles, the same carefully curated meal, the same unspoken tension hanging over the table like a storm cloud waiting to break. Matthew barely tasted the food. He was too focused on Nia. She took small bites, forcing each one down with visible effort. At one point, she excused herself to the restroom, and when she returned, she barely touched her plate again. Helen, as always, pretended not to notice. After dinner, Helen packed up leftovers for them, as she always did. Matthew took them without comment, his pulse hammering in his throat. When they got home, he waited. He pretended to go to bed, lying in the dark and listening to the faint sounds of Nia moving through the apartment. He heard the fridge open, the rustle of plastic containers being shifted. Then silence. Then the sound of the trash can lid. Matthew lay still, staring at the ceiling. He forced himself to breathe evenly, to wait just a little longer before getting up. When he was certain Nia had gone to bed, he slipped out of the bedroom and into the kitchen. The trash can was closed, but he already knew what he would find. Slowly, he lifted the lid. The food was there, every container untouched, buried beneath paper towels and empty wrappers. A chill ran down his spine. He turned to the counter where his laptop sat and pulled up the camera footage. His hands were shaking. The video played in silence. He watched as Nia entered the kitchen, moving with the careful precision of someone performing a ritual. She opened the fridge, pulled out the containers, and hesitated. Her hands trembled as she gripped them. For a moment, she just stood there, staring down at the food as if debating something with herself. Then, slowly, deliberately, she turned towards the trash. Matthew watched as she lifted the lid as she placed each container inside, covering them with napkins as if trying to erase the evidence of what she had done. But it was what she did next that made his blood run cold. She stepped back from the trash can, pressing a hand to her stomach. She was breathing heavily, her shoulders rising and falling with each unsteady breath. Then she turned toward the sink, gripping the edge as if steadying herself, and she started to cry. Not loud, not with sobs, but silent, broken tears that fell down her face as she clutched the counter like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Matthew felt something deep inside him fracture. He didn't understand. Why was she doing this? Why was she so afraid? And then, as if answering his unspoken question, Nia whispered something. It was so quiet, barely audible over the faint hum of the kitchen appliances, but Matthew heard it. "I can't do this anymore." The video ended. Matthew sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, his mind spiraling into 1,000 different directions. He had been right. Something was terribly wrong. But now he realized he had been asking the wrong question. Not why was she avoiding the food, but what was in it that made her so afraid to eat it. And suddenly, Matthew wasn't just suspicious anymore. He was terrified. Matthew sat motionless in front of the laptop, the dim glow of the screen casting sharp shadows on his face. His heart pounded steadily, each beat echoing in his ears as he replayed the video in his mind, over and over again. He had set up the camera expecting to confirm a suspicion, to find a simple answer to a question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. But what he had discovered was something far worse than he could have imagined. Nia wasn't just avoiding his mother's food. She was afraid of it. The way her hands had trembled, the way she had hesitated before throwing the food away, the way she had broken down afterward, whispering words that were not meant to be heard, none of it made sense. Unless, of course, there was something deeper, something she hadn't told him, something she was too scared to say. Matthew swallowed against the tightness in his throat and forced himself to take a deep breath. He couldn't sit here all night, staring at a screen and letting his mind spiral into dark places. He needed answers, real ones. But first, he needed to talk to Nia. She was asleep when he entered the bedroom, curled on her side beneath the covers, her breathing steady but shallow. The dim light from the hallway illuminated the contours of her face, the faint traces of exhaustion lingering in the lines around her eyes. She looked fragile in a way he had never seen before. He hesitated. Waking her up now wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't undo what had already happened. And yet, the thought of waiting until morning, of letting another night pass with this weight pressing on his chest, was unbearable. Gently, he sat on the edge of the bed and reached for her hand. Her fingers twitched slightly at his touch, but she didn't stir. "Nia," he whispered. She shifted, her brow furrowing slightly, but her eyes remained closed. He gave her hand a soft squeeze. "Baby, wake up." This time she stirred, her lashes fluttering before her eyes opened slowly. For a moment, she looked disoriented, her gaze unfocused as she adjusted to the dim light. Then she saw him, and something flickered in her expression, something that looked dangerously close to fear. "Matt?" Her voice was thick with sleep, but there was an edge of wariness to it. He hesitated, suddenly unsure of how to begin. But there was no easy way to ask the question that had been burning inside him since he watched that video. "Why are you throwing away the food from my mom's house?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unmovable. Nia's fingers tensed in his, and she pulled her hand away slowly. She sat up slightly, the sheets pooling around her waist as she looked at him with tired, guarded eyes. "I told you," she said quietly. "I just haven't been hungry." He shook his head. "That's not true." Silence. Matthew leaned forward, his voice softer now. "I saw you, Nia. I saw you throw it away, every single time." Something shifted in her expression, an instant of panic, followed by something closer to resignation. She exhaled slowly, looking down at her hands as she twisted the edge of the blanket between her fingers. "I didn't want to lie to you," she said finally, "but I didn't know how to tell you." He felt his stomach tighten. "Tell me what?" She hesitated again, her throat moving as she swallowed hard. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "I think your mother's putting something in my food." The words knocked the air from his lungs. He stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the moment when she would laugh and tell him she was joking. But she didn't. She only looked at him with tired, haunted eyes, her body tense as if bracing for his reaction. His voice felt distant when he finally spoke. "You... what?" "I don't know what it is," she continued, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "But every time I eat something she's made, I get sick. Not just once, not just a stomachache here and there. It's been happening for months, and I didn't know how to tell you because I knew how it would sound. But I swear to you, Matt, I'm not making this up." Matthew couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. His mother was strict, traditional, sometimes cold, but she wasn't cruel. She wouldn't do that, he said before he could stop himself. A flash of pain crossed Nia's face, but she didn't look surprised. "I wanted to believe that too," she said, "but I can't ignore what's been happening. I've tried to tell myself it was just coincidence, that maybe my body just doesn't agree with something she uses. But then I started paying attention. The only time I ever feel like this is after eating something she's given me." His mind rebelled against the idea. Helen had been overbearing, yes, controlling, yes. But poisoning someone? That was insane. And yet, he thought about the way Helen always insisted on serving Nia's plate herself. The way she watched her eat, eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite place. The way she never seemed concerned when Nia grew pale at the dinner table, when she excused herself early. A cold weight settled in his stomach. "What if it's nothing?" he said, more to himself than to her. "What if—" "I sent some of the food to a lab." His head snapped up. "What?" Nia's fingers tightened around the blanket. "A friend of mine at the gallery has a brother who works in food testing. I gave him a sample a few weeks ago just to be sure. He said there wasn't anything obviously toxic in it, but that doesn't mean there's nothing there. Some things metabolize too quickly to leave traces." Matthew felt like the world had tilted beneath him. He couldn't deny it anymore. Couldn't write it off as paranoia or misunderstanding, because Nia had been afraid to tell him, because she had been hiding the food, throwing it away in secret, because she had been getting sick, and no doctor could explain why, because Helen had never wanted her here. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. His mother had been trying to hurt his wife. He felt sick. Nia watched him, waiting. She wasn't asking him to believe blindly. She was waiting to see if he would listen, if he would trust her. And for the first time, he saw things clearly. Matthew reached for her hand again, gripping it tightly. "I believe you." Nia's breath hitched, her shoulders shaking slightly as if she had been holding in that tension for too long. "What do we do?" she whispered. Matthew's jaw tightened. "We get proof," he said, "and then we stop her." Matthew didn't sleep that night. Even after Nia had drifted off, exhausted from finally voicing what she had been carrying alone for months, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts spinning in endless circles. The weight of what she had told him pressed against his chest like a vice, suffocating and impossible to ignore. He had spent his entire life believing in the unwavering love and devotion of his mother. Helen had always been his rock, the one who raised him after his father's death, the one who sacrificed everything to make sure he had a good life. The idea that she could be capable of something so vile, so deliberate, was beyond comprehension. And yet, he had seen the fear in Nia's eyes. She wasn't lying. She had been getting sick. She had tested the food. She had been hiding the truth from him, not because she didn't trust him, but because she was afraid of what it would mean for them both if she said it out loud. He had told her he believed her, and he did. But belief wasn't enough. They needed proof. The next morning, Matthew made a decision. He would confront his mother, but not yet. First, he had to see it for himself. He had to know beyond a shadow of a doubt what she was doing. Over breakfast, Nia barely touched her food. The tension between them was thick, unspoken words hanging in the air. He reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "We'll figure this out," he said. She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "You don't have to do this alone." He nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. All he knew was that this was something he had to see through. That evening, he called Helen. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright, as if she had been expecting him. "Matthew, I was just thinking about you." He swallowed hard, forcing his tone to remain even. "Hey, Mom, I was wondering if Nia and I could come over for dinner tomorrow night." A pause, just long enough to notice. Then, "Of course, sweetheart, I'd love that." He wasn't sure if he imagined the smile in her voice. The following night, they arrived at Helen's house just as the sun was setting, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn. The house looked the same as it always had, warm, inviting, filled with the comforting scent of herbs and slow-cooked sauces. It smelled like home. And yet, for the first time in his life, Matthew felt like a stranger walking through the door. Helen greeted them with open arms, her smile as polished as ever. If she sensed anything different about them, she didn't let it show. "I made your favorite," she told him, guiding them toward the dining room. "Lasagna, just like when you were little." Matthew felt Nia stiffen beside him, but she said nothing. The table was set beautifully, every dish arranged with meticulous care. Helen served their plates herself as she always did, dishing out generous portions with an almost exaggerated flourish. When she placed Nia's plate in front of her, she hesitated just for a fraction of a second, so quick that, if Matthew hadn't been watching for it, he might have missed it. But he saw, and he knew. They ate in silence, or at least it felt that way to him. His mother talked, filling the space with idle conversation, asking about his job, his projects, anything except Nia. It was the same dance they had done for years, the same performance of civility that had always masked something colder beneath the surface. But this time, Matthew wasn't just a participant. He was observing. Nia picked at her food, taking only the smallest bites. Matthew forced himself to eat normally, though every swallow felt heavier than the last. He could feel Helen watching them, gauging, waiting. Then, without thinking, he reached for Nia's plate. Helen's eyes flickered. "Sweetheart, you have your own," she said, her voice light, playful. "I just want a bite," he said casually, lifting the fork to his mouth. Helen's hand tightened around her glass of wine. The moment the food touched his tongue, he felt it. A bitterness, faint but distinct, underlying the rich flavors of the sauce. It wasn't overpowering, but it was there. Subtle, deliberate. He swallowed, his stomach turning, his pulse hammering in his ears. Helen was still watching him, her expression unreadable. He set down the fork slowly. The rest of the meal passed in a blur. When they finally left, the weight in his chest was unbearable. He gripped the steering wheel as they drove home, his knuckles white. Nia sat beside him, silent, waiting. When they got inside, he went straight to the fridge and pulled out the containers of leftovers Helen had sent home with them. His hands were shaking. "We need to test this," he said. Nia nodded, already reaching for her phone. 2 days later, the results came back. The food contained trace amounts of a substance known to cause digestive distress, nausea, and long-term gastrointestinal issues if consumed over time. It wasn't lethal, but it was enough. Enough to make someone sick. Enough to make someone doubt themselves. Enough to make them feel weak, exhausted, unwell. Enough to make them want to leave. Matthew stared at the report, his vision blurring. The weight of it was suffocating. His mother had been poisoning his wife, not to kill her, just to break her, just to make him doubt her, just to drive her away. He felt sick. Beside him, Nia let out a shuddering breath. She wasn't surprised, just tired. Matthew set the paper down and exhaled slowly. "We have to confront her." Nia looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Are you ready for that?" He didn't know, but he knew he didn't have a choice. The woman who had raised him, the woman he had trusted his entire life, had betrayed him in a way he couldn't begin to comprehend. And now he had to face her, not as her son, but as the man who would no longer let her control him. Matthew stood in front of his mother's house, his breath steady, but his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The weight of the truth settled heavy in his chest, suffocating, a presence he could neither ignore nor push away. He had spent his entire life trusting this woman, believing in her unwavering love, in the sacrifices she had made for him, in the foundation she had built beneath his feet. But now that foundation was crumbling, the walls of his childhood crashing down around him. Nia stood beside him, silent but strong. Her fingers curled around his, offering quiet support, though he could feel the tension in her grip. She had been waiting for this moment far longer than he had. He had been blind to it, unwilling to see the truth that had been staring him in the face. But now there was no denying it, no running from it. He squeezed her hand once, a silent promise, before stepping forward and ringing the doorbell. Helen answered within seconds, as if she had been expecting them. Her face lit up with the usual warmth, a smile carefully placed, polished, perfected. For a brief moment, he saw her as he always had. His mother, the woman who had raised him, the woman who had always known exactly how to pull him close while keeping him under her control. "Matthew, sweetheart," she said, stepping aside to let them in, "this is a surprise." He walked past her without responding, the weight of what he knew too great for pleasantries. He didn't take off his jacket, didn't sit, didn't let himself hesitate. He went straight to the dining room where they had sat so many times before, where he had once laughed and eaten and believed that this house was a place of love. Helen followed, her expression shifting slightly. She glanced at Nia, her smile thinning. "Is everything all right?" Matthew turned to face her, his throat tight. "No, Mom, it's not." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Helen's expression barely faltered, but he saw it, the flicker of something behind her eyes. Calculation. She had always been quick, always knew how to adjust, how to mold herself into whatever shape was needed to maintain control. "I don't understand," she said smoothly, tilting her head slightly. "Why don't we sit and talk? I just made tea." "No," Matthew said sharply, "we're not here for tea." Nia stood beside him, her posture straight, her face unreadable. He could feel the tension in her body, the way she held herself still, waiting. Helen sighed, as if he were exhausting her, as if this were nothing more than a childish tantrum. "Sweetheart, you're upset. Whatever this is, I'm sure we can talk about it rationally." Matthew's jaw clenched. "You've been poisoning Nia." The words landed between them like a thunderclap, loud and inescapable. Helen blinked once. Then she let out a short, breathy laugh. "Matthew, that's ridiculous." "It's not," he said, his voice steady. "We tested the food. We know." For a moment, something flickered across her face. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "You tested the food?" she repeated, her tone measured, controlled. Matthew nodded. "Yes." Helen exhaled softly, shaking her head. "Oh, Matthew, my poor boy." She looked at him with something close to pity. "I know what's happening here. I've seen it before. This woman—" She gestured vaguely toward Nia without looking at her, as if she were an afterthought. "Has turned you against me. She's put ideas in your head, made you doubt your own mother." Nia remained silent, unmoving, but Matthew saw the way her hands curled into fists at her sides. "I saw you," he said, his voice low, trembling with controlled rage. "On the camera. I saw you do it." Helen stilled, just for a second. A pause. Barely there, but enough. Enough to confirm everything. Then she smiled. Not the warm, motherly smile he had grown up with, but something else. Something sharp, brittle, full of something dark and cold. "You never should have married her," she said quietly. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on them. "I knew from the moment I saw her," Helen continued, her voice soft, measured, as if she were explaining something simple, something inevitable. "She doesn't belong in our family, Matthew. She never did." Matthew's breath caught in his throat. "She's not one of us," Helen went on. "She doesn't understand our traditions, our history. She never could. And I knew, if I let it go on, if I stood back and did nothing, she would take you from me." Her gaze shifted to Nia then, sharp as glass. "That's what they do, don't they?" Matthew's entire body went rigid. His hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening until his teeth ached. "I thought you would see it," Helen murmured, shaking her head. "I thought, with enough time, you would realize." She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "But no, you were blind. You let her lead you away from your own family." Matthew's voice was low, barely above a whisper. "You tried to poison my wife." "I didn't try to kill her," Helen said, as if that made it better. "Just enough to make her weak. Just enough to show you who she really is. Just enough so you would finally understand." A heavy silence fell between them, suffocating and unmoving. Then Matthew spoke, his voice quieter than before, but full of something colder than she had ever heard from him. "You're not my family anymore." Helen flinched, for the first time showing something close to genuine emotion. "Matthew, No." His voice was firm. "You don't get to talk your way out of this. You don't get to manipulate your way back into my life. You did this. You made this choice. And now you live with it." Helen's face twisted, panic flickering in her eyes. "You can't mean that." "I do," he said. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, to say something, anything, that would undo what had just happened. But he didn't. And finally, something broke in her expression. Matthew reached for Nia's hand, turning toward the door without another word. Helen didn't stop him. She just watched as he walked away. Outside, the night air was sharp, cutting through the suffocating weight that had settled over him. Nia squeezed his hand tightly, grounding him, reminding him of why he had done this. He turned to her, exhaling slowly. "Are you okay?" She nodded. "Are you?" He hesitated, then nodded too. "I will be." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more like it. Share this video with others and let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're ready for another gripping tale, check out our next video.